About a year ago, Aster released his second feature film Midsommar. If you don't know what it is, essentially a group of college students go to a Swedish commune to join the May Day celebrations. As it turns out, this commune is probably better described as a cult. They practice ritual suicides and sacrifices to pagan gods and are just all round pretty creepy. While the central conflict is about a dysfunctional relationship, what really interested me was the cult itself and the folk horror subgenre that this film firmly puts itself in. When the film came out, I read a review that described it as Wes Anderson's The Wicker Man. Obviously everyone knows who Wes Anderson is, and I'm not entirely sure I agree with that part of the review, but the Wicker Man part did interest me. I was vaguely familiar with the Wicker Man film. I knew it involved like a group of strange people that turns out to be a crazy murderous cult, but that's about it. And having loved Midsommar and this seeming like another entry into the folk horror subgenre, I thought I should probably give it a chance and check it out. And a whole year later, I finally got around to watching it and it was pretty good. It definitely showed its age at times, and the acting towards the end was maybe a bit over the top, but the screenplay was solid and the premise is the main thing I liked about it. Maybe I have a thing for cults, I don't know. After watching it, I can definitely see why it's compared to Midsommar, or why Midsommar is compared to it, as The Wicker Man came out 46 years earlier. The characters are very different and the central conflict is very different, but what is similar is the vibe and maybe some broad strokes of the story. So in this video I'm going to compare the two films, looking at the plot and the setting of both, the vibes of both, the cult of both, and maybe any messages these two films convey. An outsider going to a strange cult-like community that is isolated from wider society. At first the community welcomes them and offers them hospitality, but eventually more and more sinister elements are revealed, such as pagan beliefs in sacrifice and rebirth. It all ends in a big fire burning people as tribute to the gods. All of these elements are present in both Midsommar and The Wicker Man, so obviously they have some common ground narrative-wise. However, as I said before, they have very different characters and central conflicts. Midsommar focuses around a dysfunctional relationship and our main character Danny's search for some kind of belonging after a family was killed. The Wicker Man starts off just about a police officer called Howie searching for a missing girl, so I think it's fair to say the conflict of Midsommar is much more personal than The Wicker Man and has much higher stakes emotionally. I also feel like we know and understand Danny on a more personal level to Howie. We know her past, her relationships, her mental state, etc. This could lead to us being more invested in Danny's story rather than Howie's, as we know little about Howie apart from the fact that he's just a Christian police officer. So Danny clearly has more of an intrinsic and personal conflict, whereas Howie's motivation is more extrinsic. This indicates that Midsommar is more of a character-based film, whereas The Wicker Man is more of a conventional horror, as by the end Howie's just trying to survive. Another major difference that these two films obviously have is the setting. Midsommar is on a small but built-up island off the coast of Scotland called Summer Isle, and Midsommar is in Haga, a field up in Sweden where it's just so bright all the time because it's like really far north. Obviously at first glance the setting of Haga is much more alien than Summer Isle and is instantly a far cry from what the characters are used to, whereas The Wicker Man has much more of a steady build up as the pagan elements are revealed gradually and the tension slowly rises. This is really the whole point of the film. On the other hand, Midsommar kind of throws you in the deep end. There's never any illusion that Haga isn't a cult, and while the setting is developed, it's never the main focus of the story. Instead, emphasis is put on Danny and Christian's relationship. So I feel like the setting of The Wicker Man is much more central to the film than the setting of Midsommar. Ultimately, while they do have basic narrative threads in common, the plot in both films is very different, with The Wicker Man having more of a straight up horror plot with emphasis on the setting, with Midsommar focusing on more of a breakup, with the setting acting as more of a backdrop that pushes the plot forward but is rarely the main focus. Another major difference is the characters. While in both films the central characters are outsiders, their personality and character traits couldn't be more different. Howie is a police officer. This grants him a level of status and greater authority. It's revealed that he's a strong Christian, so he finds the pagan beliefs more troublesome. When he goes to Summer Isle, he's confident and focused on getting the job done and finding the missing girl, asking the locals about her as soon as he lands. On the other hand, Danny's just been through some intense trauma and is naturally more shy and reserved than Howie, and she isn't the only outsider present as she's with her friends. Well, they're more of her boyfriend's friends really. Danny gains more status as the film progresses, starting as an outsider and ending as the May Queen, being literally elevated and put on a pedestal by the cult members. This is in contrast to Howie, who starts at a position of higher status but by the end is reduced to just a pawn in Lord Summer Isle's plan, being dragged along and begging for his life. The fact that Howie is the only outsider on the island could add to the suspense and the horror factor, as it makes him more vulnerable because he's all alone, contributing to The Wicker Man feeling more like a conventional horror. But while Danny does have others physically with her, she's essentially an outsider even to her friends. She doesn't really get on all that well with any of them, her relationship with Christian is breaking down, and she wasn't even properly invited. This lack of home or lack of family is really what the plot of Midsommar is about. The film starts on Danny losing her old family and ends on her finding a new one. Howie's story is much more straightforward and surface level. He just wants to find a missing girl and eventually he just wants to survive. The film is more about slowly revealing Summer Isle as a dangerous cult than it is about Howie. Again, this indicates how the Wicker Man puts the setting front and centre and almost above the characters in a way, whereas Midsommar focuses on the characters and the more personal conflicts that these characters have. If I had to summarise how the story and the characters are different in these two films, I'd say the Wicker Man is more plot driven, with the characters serving the story, whereas Midsommar is more character focused, with the setting and the plot just serving as a vessel for the central character's development. Other common elements are the beliefs and practices of the cult. They both have some kind of belief in the circle of life. This is seen by the elderly people happily jumping off cliffs as their time has come in Midsommar, and in the Wicker Man they believe someone's spirit can be used to grow plants after they die. It's also lucky that we meet both of the cults during their May Day celebrations. They both dance around maypoles, and we even get to see pictures of the previous year's May Queens in both films. So the cults are strikingly similar, having common beliefs, traditions and celebrations, and I'd say that's probably the main reason why these two films are compared to each other. Another area of common ground between the two cults is that they both have strong sexual elements. A key part of Midsommar is how the cult want Christian to impregnate one of their members, and this acts as a turning point which causes Danny to reject her old life and embrace the cult. There is a similar, albeit more abstract point during the Wicker Man when Howie becomes almost possessed while the landlord's daughter is performing some kind of ritual in the next room. It's later revealed that she was inviting him to sleep with him. In fact, the community is routinely very open about sexuality, with most of the rituals taking place naked. This openness helps cement the tightly wound Christian Howie as an outsider, and how the community makes him uncomfortable and alienated. The film was released in the 70s, so it could also tap into the growing hippie movement in terms of sexual openness and how many regarded hippies to be pagans back in the day. The subtext of Midsommar instead explores relationships and mental illness, looking at how Christian treats Danny's anxiety and trauma as a burden while the cult adopts her pain and suffers it with her, making her feel more at home. A key part of Haga is their approach to empathy and how they mirror each other's emotions. Repeatedly throughout the film, everyone in the cult mimics each other's emotional reactions, seen in the ritual suicide scene where the old people jump off the cliff and the sex scene with Christian. I think this demonstrates a key difference between Danny's old home with Christian and her new home with the cult, as Christian shows little empathy while the cult show loads. This contrast is most clearly seen when you compare how Christian reacts to Danny crying and how the cult does. After Danny finds out her family's been killed, Christian kind of just holds her while she screams and wails in pain. When she finds out Christian cheated on her with a cult member, she has a similar response. But the cult mimic her reaction, sharing her pain and in turn making her feel more at home and more accepted. So while the Wicker Man subtext could be about hippie culture in the 70s, Midsommar could be seen to explore ideas of empathy and how we treat other people's trauma. So obviously they have very different messages and characters and story, but what they do have in common is a similar vibe. As I said before, there's a sense that something isn't right, that our characters are in danger but they just don't know it yet in both films. In Midsommar, a strong component of this is the fact that it's always daytime. This disorientates the characters and makes the setting feel more alien and disconcerting. The blindingly bright cinematography that is present throughout the whole film acts as a constant reminder for this that they're in an unknown place that works differently to what they're used to. The Wicker Man also has this vibe, which is established in the very first scene. We see Howie fly into this remote island, straight away establishing that he is physically isolated. But this is all done to the sound of folk music in an unknown language that sounds almost ritualistic and a bit creepy. But this music soon ends and is replaced by more familiar English folk music, establishing first and foremost that this film's sinister elements will be hidden and covered up by more friendly aspects. Another way these films, but mainly Midsommar really, create an unfamiliar vibe is through the use of drugs. Psychedelics are used throughout Midsommar. At first they are taken willingly and work to mainly just elevate the imagery and accentuate the brightness of the location. But Danny only takes them due to pressure from Christian, instantly putting her more on edge and also demonstrating how their relationship works. They then pop up again to just make the characters feel more unsure of themselves and on edge, and ultimately they're used to drug Christian to have sex with the cult member. They're only used once in The Wicker Man, during the scene I talked about when Howie appears almost possessed by the landlord's daughter. This establishes that the cult has at least some degree of control over Howie, perhaps foreshadowing the reveal that the whole plot was orchestrated by Lord Summerisle to get a human sacrifice. So drugs are used in both films to give the cult the upper hand almost, and show that they have influence over our characters. Regardless, both films definitely have an atmosphere that puts you on edge. This could be seen as a red herring in Midsommar, as ultimately Danny isn't in any real danger, but it's really the whole point of The Wicker Man, again contributing to the idea that it has more of a conventional horror plot. Ultimately, while both films obviously have a similar premise and are firmly placed in that folk horror subgenre, what they're trying to achieve is very different. I would say The Wicker Man is more of a straight up horror, immersing yourself in this crazy society through the eyes of Howie. We should feel scared and intimidated by the cult. The main conflict eventually boils down to trying not to be killed, and our main character has been manipulated all along. The ending is also par for the course for horror films, our characters killed, leaving a horrific taste in your mouth. Midsommar on the other hand isn't a conventional horror, in fact I wouldn't really call it a horror film at all. While there are definitely horror elements, the cult being creepy and characters being murdered for example, the main conflict is always around Danny and Christian. Danny is never really in much danger, not from the cult at least, and the real antagonist is Christian. The cult and the horror elements just serve as a backdrop for a breakup movie. Aster even says that Midsommar is a breakup movie, going as far to say the film is more of a fairy tale than a horror film. In terms of subtext, Midsommar seems to have themes of mental illness and obviously toxic relationships, and while I get the sense that it does have more to say than The Wicker Man, the latter could definitely be seen as a commentary on hippie culture of the time. So while I would say that on the surface the two films seem similar, they are fundamentally different in their main conflict and what they're trying to achieve. I think I'm going to end on a quote by Aster from Empire magazine. He stated that I let go of The Wicker Man as an influence the minute I decided to make this, and that he pointed to The Wicker Man to set up expectations but then take a left turn from there and go somewhere surprising. So while he clearly acknowledges the similarities between the two films, he actively tried to subvert what we would come to expect from Midsommar after watching The Wicker Man.